All right, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you are here today. My name is Sarah McAllister, and I am the Associate Director here for Alumni Career and Professional Development. And I'm really excited to kick off our conversation today with Laurel Hanson. As you can see in the title, we are going to be talking about industry insights, international development, and disaster prevention, and so much more. I had the pleasure of meeting Laurel in New York maybe like 2 months ago now at an event. And it was one of those conversations where we were just chatting and networking. And the more I heard her talk, I was like, you do some really amazing things and other people should hear about this. So that's my goal for today, is to learn a little bit more about Laurel's experience, and especially if you have interest in, right, kind of any of these intersections around international development. Also, she has quite a bit of experience in federal government work, just this like really interesting intersection of, I would say, like the government, United Nations, disaster prevention, like what is disaster prevention, right? So with that, as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about our topic today. And let me get us out of, sorry, my screen is doing something really funky. Okay, I'm back. So with that, I'd love to just hand it over to you, Laurel, and introduce yourself however you want, and then we'll kind of go through some questions.
Sure. So hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. My name's Laurel Hanson, and I graduated from Tulane in their international development program through the Payson Center in 2011. Since then, I've worked in Nicaragua, Myanmar, Mongolia, Mexico, and I've had a really, great time doing it. I think international development is a really interesting career, and there are lots of pathways that we can talk about into the sector. I've worked with NGOs, and also now I'm with the UN. A lot of my work has been kind of in government contracting and institutional fundraising, and then implementing those programs as well. So it's also changed over the years. I loved my time at Tulane, and I think it was very formative for me in terms of what I do now. I was one of the classes after Katrina, and just seeing the way that it impacted the city across development decisions that were already in place. So decisions like where to put populations, where to build bridges, and the infrastructure, the kind of injustices that were apparent in the city before were exacerbated by the disaster. That happens all throughout the world, and that's really framed a lot of my viewpoint looking at development decisions and their impacts on vulnerable populations. So super excited to talk to you guys today. And yeah, Sarah, I guess over to you to begin the questions.
Yeah, great. I do want to clarify, I realized I hadn't mentioned it earlier. So this is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. Nicole can drop that link in if you want to check out the recording later, as well as any other recordings. Okay, so Laurel, I'd love to just kind of start a bit of where you were just talking about, is walk us through a little bit more of, when you, I guess a more specific question is, when you started at Tulane, did you have a sense of, I mean, obviously, like maybe you didn't know like this is where you wanted to be, or maybe you did, like what did you think you wanted to do versus what you are doing now? Like what's that journey like for you?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I was lucky to be kind of like exposed to people that were working internationally at Tulane, and also growing up. So I think when I got to Tulane, I started studying in like the School of Political Science, and I found those courses really interesting. I also liked languages, so I did like a double major in Spanish. And I think throughout my coursework at Tulane, I was exposed to a bunch of professors, including through the School of Social Work, that kind of helped me bring my track together. I think I didn't really understand a lot about the different kinds of careers that you can have in international development. I don't think most people do. I'm still learning myself. So it was really helpful to talk to professors about what their friends did, what people that went to school with them did, and to try to gain insights in that way. One of the classes that I really liked was on Tibetan refugees through the School of Social Work. So I took that class and then went on a service learning trip to India, and I was in McLeod-Ganj, and there also just making connections and talking to people about their path helped me kind of take that first step, which was that I wanted a career in international development, and that was what I wanted to do my double major in. At that time, it was kind of like a co-major, so I did it with Spanish. I think my path to disaster risk reduction has been a little bit winding. I mean, I think a lot of people haven't heard of disaster risk reduction or the Sendai framework. It doesn't have quite like the profile that the Sustainable Development Goals or something like the Paris Agreement do. Being in New Orleans, as I mentioned, it was really interesting to see kind of like the fault lines that were already apparent in infrastructure and urban planning in the city, exacerbated by the disaster and the disproportionate impacts on certain populations. And I didn't know at the time, but a lot of that stuff is looking at disaster risk reduction. So how do you integrate risk into development planning, and also aspects of, climate justice and other justice oriented aspects of planning and development decisions? It's hard because political cycles are super short term often. So if you have someone in office for 4 years, they're often going to make a more popular short-term decision versus a long-term decision that would actually affect future risk, including climate risks. I was always very interested in environmental science. I think it's pretty cool. So it was kind of a blend of those. When I first started, my first job out of school, I was an intern in Nicaragua for something called the Foundation for Sustainable Development. And there I was working on environmental programs with rural populations, mostly doing also like coastal programming and things around recycling and environmental awareness. From there, I moved to like the capital of Nicaragua, which is called Managua. That was my first like paid job with them, and paid job in general, besides working in New Orleans at like the dough bowl boot situation, which was not, I don't know if that's like, I think it's important to mention that like it wasn't necessarily a soft landing for me to get to where I am now. And when I was in Managua, I was focused on not only environmental program, but also microfinance and public health initiatives as well. And so it gave me exposure to a bunch of different sectors. From there, I got a job with Save the Children. So I worked for Save the Children for a long time, doing proposal development, or new business development, it's sometimes called. I think proposal development and new business development are really good foot in the door jobs in international development, because often you'll have sort of like a junior proposal writer that works with a more senior proposal writer, and you'll rotate across different sectors. So when I say sectors, it could be like education, public health, water and sanitation, infrastructure, food security. Those are sectors within international development. So you would rotate across and work on different proposals in different countries. And that kind of gave me the knowledge about different sectors that I needed to push myself forward. The way that SAVE worked, it was disaster risk reduction was often mainstreamed across them. So if we're building a school, is the school going to be resilient to the type of hazards that are common to the area? Also, how are we talking about those hazards in school? Are we having kids make plans with their families in case there's a hurricane or another natural hazard that hits the area? And you can also integrate it in food security. So looking at future climate projections, what are crop resistant crops, or what are drought resistant crops, or dependent on area flood resistant crops that you can promote, and how do you help rural farmers adapt to the projected and current impacts? So I kind of like gained more insights into DRR that way. When I worked with SAVE, I also did I deployed and worked on emergencies. So what they would do is, like, if there was an emergency, they would send proposal writers out to do immediate fundraising. And I was lucky enough to be part of some of those teams. And my last assignment before I moved was in Myanmar. So I was sent to Myanmar to work on kind of adjustment of a proposal that had been very humanitarian focused, which is often looking at short-term relief to more rehabilitation and reconstruction. And while I was there, Cyclone Koman hit the region that we were working in, and they needed people to stay on the ground. So then I took another field assignment to stay on with the team there. And after that, I was pretty sure that I wanted to be in the DRR space. So I went back to grad school. I think it was really valuable for me, at least, to have had that kind of period where I worked and was gaining a lot of really necessary skills And also kind of like exploring the different kinds of jobs that I could have before I went to grad school. I know in this line of work, sometimes people go right away, but that was the better decision for me. And I guess that's why. So I went to King's College in London. Their programs are really good in GRR and international development in general. The specialization that I had was called disasters, climate adaptation, and development. So looking at the intersection of all of those three things. After that, I moved to Mongolia, where I was working with nomadic pastoralists on early warning systems development and other climate-related adaptation programs, and also on urban air pollution projects as well. So I think I just talked like quite a lot, and hopefully I didn't skip around too much, but feel free to let me know if I did, or if there were any questions that came up while I was kind of rambling there.
No, thank you for just taking us through that journey. And I will echo what you just said about questions. Feel free to, everyone that's on, just feel free to use the chat for questions, and we'll weave them in as we're talking. I'd love to, kind of have you talk us through. I mean, you walked us through you've had so many different experiences, and I'm curious, thinking about the role of mentorship, or maybe mentorship maybe it's not as formal as that throughout this whole time, but right, I think so often when we hear someone share their professional journey, it's, at least for me, it's easy to picture like you did it on your own, even though I know that's not true, right? And so how did that work throughout your time so far, in terms of both formal mentoring or just leaning on people who have walked the path before you?
Sure. I mean, I think in Nicaragua, since we were working with a lot of different NGOs, I was exposed to a lot of people in very different places in their careers than I was. And, that had different energy about it, I guess. I feel like when you first get out of school, it's, I feel like it just looks like a huge box, and you're like, okay, where do I fit in, and what's going on? And I talked to like as many people as I could about what they were doing. So one woman who was the chief of party for a big USAID project. So chief of party is basically like, you're the boss of this huge, like probably like multi-million-dollar project. And you have your team under you. And learning from her about her road to get there was really interesting. I almost feel like that was like a more like surrogate daughter experience than like an equal mentorship field, if you will. But I feel like I also had people that were more at my level, and we figured it out together. When I was in DC, I would say I sought out things like young professionals in foreign policy. I really liked networking groups like that. Or there's also like the Association of International Development Professionals, YPFP, the one I mentioned before. It's free. They do happy hours and different kinds of things like that. They also have like an international development discussion group. They're in so many cities. I know that they're in New York, where I am now. And that was kind of the opportunity to more laterally network, because I think sometimes when you see someone and they're like the chief of party lady that I first met, I was like, you're so far away from where I am right now. And it helped me to like learn about her experience and how she got there. But I think sometimes like having people who are a little bit closer, in addition to people who are like goals, is really important, as you gain like the confidence to move throughout your professional life. So networking groups like YPFP for me were super helpful. When I was in Myanmar, I would say, sometimes if you're stationed abroad, especially, there's very small amounts of expats in a certain area, and you become close really quickly. And those people, I had a boss called Nick, and she was kind of like the field-based manager for where I was working. She was like, I really admire the amount of time that she spent with me, helping me learn and grow and figure out how to do things in a respectful way. I think the way that she modeled how to be an expat and work in a situation where like you don't really have the community level knowledge or the historical knowledge, and still be like a respectful professional coming in as an outsider. The way she handled herself was very like inspiring to me. So just even watching other professionals do their work, I think is a form of mentorship. Yes, I would say I've come across it in a lot of different ways. I think maintaining contact with a lot of friends that I've made along the way is also an important form of mentorship. I have a friend, Jenna, who is like my roommate in Nicaragua. We're still friends now in New York. She works in labor rights advocacy now, but even that, it's like, I think we're all, those questions that you have about where you fit in a specific space or where you fit in a sector don't necessarily go away. And it helps to have friends that are doing similar things or different things to kind of push you along, and also check you if you have like sort of existential questions about the field and different kinds of things like that. I think that's been really important for me.
Nice. Yeah, I'm getting the sense that you've really built out a network for yourself with multiple layers and multiple accountability and support. That's great. Let's talk a little bit about some of the speed bumps along the way, right? So what are the lessons that you have learned that maybe, if you could go back in time, you would give your younger self a heads up? What have those looked like?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think, like sometimes I like to think, that you can distance your emotional self from your work self. And I think in especially my work life, I really couldn't. And I think there were points, especially working in very hard contexts, where too much of my self-worth or too much of the way that I viewed myself was about work. And I think I would love to like go back and tell my younger self to be less hard on myself. I think especially as you're transitioning out of college, it's a hard couple of years. And I think it is very, very important to remember that it's a learning process and you're going to have a lot of different jobs and a lot of different opportunities throughout your career, and you're just still building towards things. So maybe comparing yourself less to others also. I mean, I think international development is a hard place to break in and be sometimes. I think once you're there, it feels good, you're in. But I remember what it was like to not, and I would look at people who had chosen much more like traditional careers. Hopefully that doesn't offend anybody, but like, like an accountant or like a lawyer or something like this. It's much easier. And comparing myself to those people didn't help. Like it wasn't a constructive way of helping myself grow. So I would hope that, I don't know, I don't like really know how to avoid that. I still do it sometimes, but it's definitely something I would want my younger self to try to work towards, not being quite so hard on yourself and deriving so much of your worth from your career.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's great insight. I do want to pivot to this great question that was just put in the chat. So any advice for someone who has a MS in disaster resilience or who would like to potentially work in UNDRR or international development in general?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would say network as much as you can. I think like I did a lot of like weird cold messaging on LinkedIn and stuff like that as I was trying to figure out where to go. And I think also applying to things for the UN, you can sit an exam called the Young Professionals Program exam. It's usually open to US nationals. Generally, it's like people from underrepresented countries, and the US is underrepresented in the UN system. So a great way to get break into the system is through the YPP exam. And I can like find the link and send it to you guys after. The US also—
I'm 33 though, so it's a little hard.
A little hard. Okay. Okay. So maybe not the YPP. There's also, you are, I believe, eligible for the Junior Professional Officer program. I would say, I think like a lot of the people that I've seen come into the system at like a more lateral level, if that makes sense, or like do like not entry level moves, have been UN adjacent. So there's something called the Sendai Stakeholders Mechanism, and it is like an NGO engagement mechanism that works with UNDRR quite closely. Getting involved with things like that, like the Global Network for Disasters Action or the Huayru Commission or some of kind of like the big players in the SEM space, I think is a really good way to get your foot in the door, because then often you're invited to a lot of the same conferences and you can do a lot of similar work. I think in the NGO space, things like I'm sure you're on Prevention Web and Relief Web looking for jobs, but I think applying for those is good. And also getting in touch with recruiters. Like if you can get in touch with, like, for example, whoever the save recruiter is right now. And I'd be happy to like connect afterwards and try to put you in touch with recruiters that I know, and just floating your CV to as many people as possible, I think is also really important. Yeah, I mean, I think knowing who the key players are in a space is like critical to moving in. The UN system is like traditionally really annoying to get into, but I think networking has definitely helped me get there. If that's where you want to be. I think also some of the bigger development contractors like a DAI or a Comonix are a great place to start. They definitely have a lot of focused technical jobs as well as more generalist management jobs. And I've seen friends who have gone that route move around with a lot within those systems. A lot of those jobs are in DC, but there are also some in New York and many abroad. So I think just looking, Prevention Web, Relief Web, being on DevX and being really active wherever you can will help. And let me know if there's anything I can do to help.
Awesome. Thank you. I do want to, this is going to be so granular, but I always want to ask it. So you talked about the cold messages on LinkedIn. I think one of the biggest questions that I know Nicole and I get is like, what do you say? Right? Like, what were you saying on LinkedIn? So not word for word if you don't, but can you just kind of give us a little bit of, how did you walk through that process?
I mean, I think like also the thing about cold messaging is I think I had like a 30 or 40% response rate. And I was like, this is good. Like I'll just like copy and paste over and over and over again until somebody wants to be my friend. Like, I would be like, I think when I get those now, like keeping them to like a paragraph, I think is really good. Like if it gets too long, sometimes it's hard because I really struggle with like wanting to be really respectful and like answer everything and balancing my own time. And I think, keeping it like, hi, I'm doing this. I want to do this. Do you have 30 minutes or something like that? It's a lot easier to digest than some of the longer cover letter style messages, if you will. I think, I would also try when I could. Sometimes, to be honest, it was just like a copy and paste across different things and like changing the name, like, hi, I'm Laurel. I just graduated with a master's from King's or whatever it was, and I'm interested in this. I think if you can devote the time, or if you have the time, or if you're really specifically interested in what someone is doing, it's great to find like a paper that they did or something to connect on specifically that they were interested in or involved in, and ask them a question that shows that you've kind of like done your homework, if you will. I think that also provides a much more interesting conversation start point than a general one where you're like, hey, what's up? What's going on? How did you get to this point? I think it's really interesting the perspective that you had here. What are the steps that led you there is always great. But again, that takes time. Not everyone has that. And job hunting is a full-time job a lot of the time. So I think a mix of, just doing what you can whenever you can is good.
That's great. Thank you. Let's talk. I know you've mentioned the work-life balance piece a few times. How do you define that now? And what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, especially working in like my previous life in humanitarian responses and things like that, sometimes it's all you do and you just get like, so I was not necessarily good at not getting burnt out. And I think you're not effective, or you're not as effective, you're missing things, and I was not able to show up as the person that I wanted to be when I wasn't taking care of myself. So I think now work-life balance for me, it looks different every week. Like sometimes we have like really, really busy weeks at work. For example, when like the SRSG, who's the head of our organization, is in town, it's kind of like an all hands on deck situation. We've got lots of meetings, lots of breakfast, whatever. And I know that those weeks are coming, and I'll rest and like get myself together and really compose myself for them. And then, when I can, I'll spend time like making sure I get a workout in before work or something like that. Like, I think it just took, I think it's kind of like tied to the work as identity conversation, where it's like, I think we all want to put ourselves like 100% into whatever we're doing, but to put yourself 100% responsibly into something, you also need to be taking care of yourself. And that is like how the way I define work-life balance is like, okay, sometimes I'm going to Indonesia next week for this big conference, for example, and it's going to be like full out. I'm going to be working a ton, but knowing that and preparing for that mentally and physically is different than like, constantly working myself in a way that I know I'm running down my like intellectual whatever battery and like my interpersonal battery and like all of these other things. And I think that's going to look different every week and to every person, but just making sure that you're paying attention to that so that every time you show up somewhere, you're showing up as the person that you want to be.
That's great. I think that intentionality, I don't think I've fully heard someone articulate it that well in terms of just being intentional in that week to week. That's really helpful. Let's talk about kind of, what excites you. I feel like you've talked a little bit about what's really exciting, but dive into what excites you about your job. What do you, when you are pitching it to somebody and like, what do you say? What do you love the most?
What excites me about it is, I mean, I don't think a lot of people are focusing on risk in a really systemic way. I think like systemic risk modeling and doing things like even how disasters have impacts on the financial system and complex modeling. I'm not the person doing the complex modeling, but I love to talk about it and I love to learn about it. I think it's a really like an innovative way of looking at development. And I think the trade-offs conversation. So it's like, okay, if we don't have enough money to do this, but we make this decision, it's like, okay, but down the line, what are the projected ways that that could affect the first decision that you made? Like all of that kind of like future casting and forecasted risk projections, I find fascinating because I don't think we're good at it. If we were, disasters wouldn't be disasters and they wouldn't have ricocheting effects throughout infrastructure, health, and food systems, whatever system. I think it's a really innovative space to be in right now. And I think it's really important because we're going to have more and more disasters in the context of the climate crisis and also with NatTech hazards and what's going on in energy. I mean, I think it's a growing space and more needs to be done on the prevention angle. I'm super passionate about kind of shifting the balance from preparedness for response and response action to really prevention and risk reduction oriented action, because there are so many studies that show like the economics of GRR. Like if you're investing in prevention and risk reduction, you're not spending as much money as if you're going to spend on like the actual response, and you're losing families money. So like households are spending more money to get themselves back on their feet because you didn't kind of like front load that cost. And I think it's a way of doing aid and development way more responsibly than we have in the past. And it has the potential to be really transformative and like from kind of like an environmental justice, but also a social justice angle, because I think a lot of, as I mentioned before, the systems that are in place that aren't working, if we really like transform them to be more preventative and risk reduction oriented, it has very positive co-benefits with poverty reduction and like strengthening livelihoods all across the spectrum, women's rights, children's rights. And I think integrating GRR into development decisions better. In addition, we're always probably going to need some standalone response and recovery measures, but even like preparing to build back better, like if we're investing in recovery and rehabilitation, how are we changing things? Are we creating the same patterns? Or are we creating a new pattern that's going to be transformative for the communities that were affected? I think it's just such an interesting kind of like intellectual playground to be in. And I am really motivated by helping people in the concept that hopefully, whatever work that I do between 9 and 5 or often longer, is helping. And I find that very motivating.
This is a two-part question. How do you stay up to date with all of this kind of knowledge? Like, I mean, both from just a time and then, I think so much, especially people who are trying to get into this work, you have such a holistic knowledge of everything that's going on in terms of systems and organizations. How do you stay on top of it all? We'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've like accepted that I can't, and I'm just like gonna do my best, which is a lot more. I think sometimes I would experience like information paralysis, I guess is what it's called. And then like you're like, how will I like get up to speed on all of these new developments? But there's really great knowledge products coming out of UNDR that are kind of like syntheses of like where the field is going. So the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, which came out like last month, maybe a couple of weeks ago. It does a really good job of kind of distilling the direction that we're going in. And we also have our regional offices feed into the report on the implementation of the Sendai framework, which is super. I'm working on that now, and it's been interesting to read what everyone's doing in the field and the gaps and challenges that people are seeing. I think there's a lot of innovation going on, including in like adequately pricing risk into private sector decision making, and how the insurance sector can be incentivized to reduce risks and not kind of like bankroll future catastrophes and different kinds of things like that. I think there are so many innovations going on in the field all the time, and I am lucky enough to go to a lot of talks related to GRR, and I try to stay up to date as much as I can. Sometimes I worry that I'm like, I'm in like this UN bubble where like maybe the most interesting thing is like not reaching me because it's like happening at a very micro level or something like that. But hopefully it does, I guess. And we do have systems where things can feed into each other, which is good. I like also like Prevention Web, which is a website that UNDR runs. A lot of entities will post articles and different kinds of things on there, and you can get like a digest from Prevention Web, which is like all of the articles that came out each month. And I think like that is something that has helped me to stay aware. And like if I see it, like to be honest, sometimes I just look through the headlines, and if there's like one thing where I'm like, I don't know about that, then that would be something that I would prioritize to read. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And then the other question that I had for you in terms of, both, I would say international development, but particularly the UNDRR, are there other, I mean, I know there are, so what other backgrounds, degrees, experiences can people have and also kind of get into this work? Does it just have to be kind of the international relations work, or can they come from different backgrounds?
No, I mean, I think I've seen people come from all different backgrounds. I have a lot of friends that came in through social work or through education, and maybe they then went into like working on psychosocial, I always get this hard, psychosocial service provision in disasters or in like development contexts, or education. There's always a huge demand for that. And I know some teachers that have transitioned from teaching into this space. And now like I have a friend that works for UNICEF, and that was her path. Engineering degrees are relevant to this field. There's things like a lot of camp-based infrastructure has to go up really quickly and requires a lot of maintenance, and it requires a lot of people with like very hard engineering degrees to do it. And the same with food and livelihoods. You could be like a rangeland management specialist or a natural resources management specialist in transition, and if that's the issue that you want to work on. And I think after you have a couple of years of experience, it's relatively easy to move from generalist roles to specialized roles and back and forth. And I think it's an important thing to do, because like it is a very like forest for the trees things. Like if you're not, you want to maintain like I kind of think of GR as more like a conceptual lens for viewing a bunch of different things. You can also do standalone, very technical projects like on early warning systems, for example. And I think it's important to move back and forth between those worlds, because it all has to fit together at some point. And I think that helps become a more well-rounded professional. let's see, I mean, I think I've had people who have like MPPs and stuff like that I've seen in this field, but there's a lot of opportunity. It just depends where you are and if you want to come in.
That's great. That's really helpful. As we kind of wrap up our conversation today, I'm curious, having just you walking us through all these really interesting experiences for you, anything else you feel like we should know or would be helpful?
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully I was like mostly coherent. But yeah, no, I mean, I hope that everyone that wants to be in this space is in this space. I think there's a lot of opportunities. And yeah, I hope we get more Tulane grads here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One more quick question. Oh, go ahead.
I was wondering if I can get your email to follow up with some of the recommendations you were talking about. I think you were talking a lot, like real fast, and I couldn't copy them all down. But I would love to get your email and pick your brain about stuff, especially when it comes to the Sundial framework, because they were drilling that to us at Durla. And so it's really interesting to finally meet someone who actually like is a Tulane grad, also but actually like is working on it, you know. Okay, Laurel, Hanson, okay. We'll definitely copy it down.
Awesome.
Are you familiar with the Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy at Tulane?
A little bit. I actually spoke to someone that works there a couple of weeks ago. We're doing the midterm review of the Sundial framework in 2023. It was mandated by the General Assembly 2 years ago, and it'll take place in May of 2023. And we had some initial conversations about how, to better talk to universities and stuff like that to mobilize public awareness. We're still like in the very inception stages of what that's going to look like, but I had spoken to someone there. I think that initiative through Tulane is super cool. It wasn't the thing when I was a student there, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was established a little after.
Not that long ago, yeah.
Yeah.
But in New Orleans is still focused on, like you spoke about earlier, about on like response and not mitigation and prevention, And they would tell us like $1 in prevention is like $7 in response, So
that's the current stat.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely trying to get New Orleans up to bar, which is one of the most vulnerable cities to climate change. Is kind of like a task,
Yeah, for sure.
It's very excited for you guys to connect.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to like picking your brain about a lot of stuff, because like I have like a profile on Inspira, but it's so like daunting to apply for stuff. So I just like get, like you were talking about like getting drained. Like I look at the screen and like all my energy is gone. I'm like, you know what? Time to do something else.
It is hard. And it is, even for us, they like filling out the PhD, which is the personal history profile.
That's it.
Type of resume. It's a very a lot of government jobs are like that. I would say that friends that work in the US government, you have to fill in like a very similar type of form sometimes. I think if it's comforting, it's one of those things that it's like a science, but it's kind of like, I think like when you figure out how to write to it, like if you figure out how to write an essay to a professor kind of situation, it's a lot more helpful. And
there like a learned writing style.
Yeah, there are also like YouTube videos and different kinds of people that you can work with to like, how do I do the PHP, which I think is helpful.
Yes. Thank you for the information. You were very well-spoken and very, it makes me feel better because like I work in the anti-trafficking field. I'm the regional human trafficking coordinator for the governor's office, but I got my MS in like disaster resilience. So I'm academically trained in one thing, but I do something else. But it's really good to, I guess, actually hear someone, get to meet someone who's actually working in the field, because ever since I left Tulane, I haven't been that connected with that many people who work in like the disaster risk reduction field or prevention field, period, So it's really good to connect. And I've been meaning to get back into that field because I'm very passionate about it. But so it's really good to connect, So I'm gonna take a little lunch break to learn more. So I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. I mean, I think with that, you want to send us off with thank you for your time today. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you want to just wrap us up, and then we'll say have a good afternoon.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you so much for the opportunity, and looking forward to more opportunities to connect with Tulane grads and people involved in the community moving forward. So I don't know if I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I'm not sure if anything else to say, but
I'm going to
is great.
definitely shoot you an email.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and Laurel, thanks for your time. We're definitely going to bring you back in the fall. So safe travels. All right. Bye everyone.
bye.
Bye.